Good afternoon, everybody.
Good afternoon.
My name is Dr. Denise Dennis. Thank you for joining me for this presentation on cultural sensitivity. Very important topic. I want to share with you some of the highlights of what I do in sharing this presentation with people. The real challenge is that there's so many different ways we could go with this conversation on cultural sensitivity. But basically, this is what we cover in this talk. I focus on helping people understand cultural diversity and what does that actually mean. I talk about how we need to be aware of our biases and the fact that, frankly, we all have biases, and we just need to acknowledge that and recognize that some of them are intentional, some of them are unintentional, and it's just a matter of understanding what those biases are. I spend a lot of the time talking about how we need to enhance our sensitivity to our similarities and differences, and just recognize and appreciate and understand the fact that we are all very different for a variety of reasons. And then I get into some specific ways in which we're different, specifically as that relates to the way that we communicate. Because really, the goal of all of this, the reason we want to be culturally sensitive, besides, just it's a good thing to do, but from an organization's perspective, we want to be able to communicate effectively with members of our organization, with our clients, with our customers, with members of the community, so that everything is going smoothly. So I talk a lot about verbal and nonverbal communication methods and how those differ, and how it's important to understand that different should not necessarily be interpreted as being rude or disrespectful. It may just be different. I then talk about strategies for fostering a cohesive workplace and end by talking about how we might identify appropriate and inappropriate behaviors in the workplace. So I want to take you through just some of the highlights of what I share with attendees. Part of what I talk about is what is diversity. And this workshop is very interactive. I ask people for their definitions. So you tell me, when you think diversity, what are some of the things that come to mind?
Ethnic diversity.
Ethnic diversity, okay. What are some other ways in which we're diverse?
Beliefs.
Okay.
Personality.
Religious,
Personality styles.
personality. What else?
Gender.
Gender, appearance, good. Political affiliation. So all of these are ways in which we are diverse, and some of them are things that we're born with. Some of these are things that we developed over time based on the people that we're around. So some types of our diversity we're born into, some develop, and I stress that. Because I think it's useful for us to just keep in mind the fact that some things we can change, some things we can't, but more importantly, just recognizing that we have these differences. No matter where they came from, we have ways in which we're different. Doesn't mean better, worse, again, just different. So why is this important to understand? Again, what I'm trying to do is help people develop a sense of cultural competency. And by cultural competency, I just mean that we need to understand, acknowledge, and accept the fact that we're different. So I personally do not agree with people that say, oh, I'm colorblind. I don't see where everybody's the same. It's like, we're not the same, and it's all right that we're not the same. So let's just learn to deal with the fact that we're not the same and figure out the best way to communicate with one another, understanding that we're not the same. That's all right. But in order to do that, we need to seek to understand. We need to understand how we're different, and do that in a way that's not judgmental, just acknowledging the fact that we are different, with the ultimate goal of improving our communication with one another. And I think that this is so important because often, if we're not culturally competent, we may interpret something that somebody does as being disrespectful to us, when from their perspective, that might just be how they communicate. They may be actually being respectful to you, but because you come from two different cultures, you see the world differently, the way you show respect might be different. And so if we just understand the fact that we're different and we approach things differently, it may help us improve our communication styles. So again, before we can jump into this, we need to understand our own biases. And so I do a whole exercise where I break people into groups based on birth order. So something, I don't jump into the hard stuff right away. We do based on birth order. So all the firstborns get over here, all the middle children over here, all the youngest over here, all the onlys over here. And in groups, I have people talk about how are we similar? What do other people say about this, about us? What do they assume about us? So how many people are the youngest in the room? Okay, so what are some common things that people say about you as being the youngest?
Get away with everything.
Get away with everything, spoiled. So, and so that may or may not reflect your reality, but those are the biases that we have. I'm an oldest child. Oldest children, the bias is that oldest children tend to be bossy and true in my instance, but I don't necessarily like that people assume that I'm bossy, even though I naturally am, just because I'm a firstborn. And the same thing we can apply to gender, to race, to any other label that we may have. That we have developed over time these assumptions about how people in this box behave, whether true or not, and then that influences how we interact with those people. So it's about understanding those biases that we have about people and recognizing, wow, I might be, this filter I've created might be influencing or getting in the way with how I'm interacting with people. All right, what I find to be the biggest challenge when we talk about cultural sensitivity, cultural diversity, is that on the one hand, we want to be able to respect cultural differences, our individual differences, and we want to do that, but we also don't want to stereotype people. And it's almost impossible to do in the sense that we have a tendency to naturally put people into categories. That is just human nature. It's not American, it's just human nature that when I look at this thing that has 4 legs and a seat and a back, I put that in the category chair. But I also might put it in the category of chair if it has wheels and I can sit on it, but I can kind of roll around the room. I'm still going to put it in that category of chair. And I might still put it in the category of chair if it doesn't have a back, but it still has a seat and it has four legs. I might put it in chair. I might put it over here in stool, but I'm still going to put it into some kind of category. That is just our natural way to easily classify things so we know how to interact with them. That part, there's nothing wrong with that because you can't not do that. That is just how our brain is wired. So the same thing goes with when I walk in the room, you're putting me into a category. You're seeing an African American woman who has locks and some kind of weird hairstyle today. And because of all that, you put me into some kind of category. The fact that my name tag has a little blue ribbon, which tells you that I'm the speaker for today, that caused you to put me into some kind of category. Hopefully she knows what she's talking about because she's going to be in the front of the room. So you kind of put people in a category. Now the challenge becomes, does that get in the way with seeing the actual person? So depending on how you've labeled your box, if you say, well, speakers have to spout a lot of statistics and speakers tend to be kind of boring, I'm just going to presume she's going to be boring because speakers are boring, because that's how I've categorized her. And then now I have to kind of fight my way out of this box to not be boring and not fit your preconceived idea. And that's just, again, how we tend to do. But what we need to do is be open to letting people get out of that box and recognizing that that box is something that we created and we need to be more flexible and allow people to be individuals, not just a label. The other challenge about understanding cultural sensitivity is that there's not one right answer. It would be so good if we could just Google it and there's just one right answer. But there's not one right way to treat people of a particular racial or ethnic group or cultural group or whatever. So even with me, depending on the day, depending on the audience, sometimes I'm black, sometimes I'm African American, whatever I feel like calling myself that day. And so how therefore can I expect you to call me the appropriate title when I haven't decided what label I'm using for myself that day. And I might feel very strongly, I'm an African American woman, you better not call me anything else. And the woman standing right next to me may feel very strongly she doesn't like that term. There's not a right, there's not a wrong. It's about understanding people and understanding how they wish to be treated, which you can't do until you have conversations with people. All right, so now, having said all that, let's go to the sweeping generalizations. So on the one hand, and this is what makes it so challenging, because on the one hand, it makes absolutely no sense to put people in the boxes, but on the other hand, there are some actual differences between groups of people that because of how people are raised and traditions that are passed down, there are different ways that different cultural groups see the world, different practices, different habits, different ways of interacting with one another. And so it is important to understand some of those differences. So if we look at, but also understand that the sweeping generalizations. So I always kind of have that caveat there. So if we look at some of these sweeping generalizations about African Americans, in general, diagnostic procedures, and this would be one that I would do for a healthcare organization. Diagnostic procedures may be viewed as an invasion of privacy. So what does that mean? For some people, for some African Americans, they're not going to want to, for example, go get a colonoscopy. Not that everybody's like, yay, colonoscopy, but I mean, but for some cultures, that's more invasive, viewed as more invasive than others. There's this notion of the whole village being involved in raising the family. So what does that mean from an organization's perspective, healthcare perspective? That means that you need to recognize that you might be talking to somebody's play aunt who's not really their aunt, but who's the person that's been helping to raise them, and they're going to want to know what's going on with that person's medical condition, even though they are not a blood relative. So how do you deal with that when that's really somebody who's involved in that healthcare decision? Other things, that in the African American community, there's a tendency, it's considered respectful to call somebody Mr. or Ms., use that title and their last name until you're given permission to call somebody by their first name. So if you just jump to calling somebody by their first name, it can potentially be viewed as very insulting. And then also recognizing that religion or spirituality may play a very important role in healthcare. So the person may want to have their spiritual advisor there, have their pastor there. So on the one hand, yes, this is true. May not be true for even all the African American people in this room right now, but these are some trends that we tend to see among these communities. Now, again, we also need to recognize, and this is what makes it challenging, that this does not apply to everybody, and it can't. Because even when we look at some of the terms that relate to different groups, how can you say Asian Americans when we use that term for people from Afghanistan, China, India, Syria, Japan, people that just got here, people who've been here for decades? How can you say Asian Americans act this way? That doesn't even make any sense. It just doesn't make sense. When we say African American, we're talking about 30 million people who have share some characteristics, usually just physical, that relates them to over 800 million people from all over the continent of Africa, which is made up of a bunch of different countries, and who speak over 2,000 different languages. So does it make sense to lump all those people together? Native American might be people that are mixed or are unmixed, that have a portion of Native American lineage or who are 100% Native American. There's 500 different tribes. They may or may not even identify themselves as Native American. So does it make sense? Well, we're just going to dump them all into the same box and treat them all the same way. It does not make sense. Hispanic includes people from Mexican, Puerto Rican, Cuban, Salvadorian, Dominican backgrounds, people from Central America, South America, and other Hispanic or Latino origins. And again, we're going to just put them all in one box and say, they behave this way. It does not make sense. And so for me, what makes more sense is that rather than trying to cram this person into this box and say, I'm going to, you belong in this box, I'm going to treat you this way. How about I have a conversation with you? How about I figure out what's important to you? How do I make sure that I am respecting you and you're respecting me? And we're aware of the fact that, it's not like, I'm black. It's not a secret. He probably figured that out. So, so it's not a secret. We're aware of each other's differences, but we're not just immediately saying, oh, so I have to use this language, I have to use this term, I have to he probably believes this, she probably believes this. It's about let's deal with each other as individuals and figure out how we can communicate effectively. So rather than spending the bulk of the time talking about these people behave this, just like a bad stand-up. Black rather than doing the stand-up routine, let's focus on how are we different and what are some ways that we can improve our communication. So, what are some of the ways in which our communication gets mixed up from a cultural perspective? Understanding that there are differences in how direct we are. That in some cultures, the goal is to get right to the point. So if I'm upset with you, I'm going to say, I'm upset with you. Here's why, X, Y, and Z. For other cultures, it is, you should just assume that by my body language and by my failure to talk about certain subjects. So, and again, for all of these, it's not that there's a right or a wrong, it's recognizing that these might be different ways of handling things. Different subjects for communication, the appropriate subjects for communication differ among groups. So for some people, in the workplace, you should only be talking about work. For other people, because you're with these people, if I'm more of a collectivist, come from a more collectivist culture where it's about the group and about the people, maybe I want to talk about my weekend, my relationship, what I saw on TV last night, because we're all together and we need to kind of bond on every level in order for us to get the work done. Whether or not we show emotion differs culturally. And again, the reason these are important to know is so that you understand that the person that is talking like this, they're not angry, it's just how they talk, And so you just need to understand that some people are going to be very emotional, they may cry, they may yell, but it's a cultural thing. And for other people, they may just be very straightforward and they may not ever use any hand gestures, and that's just how they communicate. Not one that's right, not one that's wrong, just different. The same with how we use loudness, pitch, and silence, or even how we deal with conflict. So dealing with conflict, some people can say, well, let's push pause on the personal issues, get the work done, and then deal with our personal drama we have going on. Other cultures, we can't possibly get the work done if we differ. So let's focus on resolving our conflict, getting on the same page, and then doing the work. So it's just about recognizing that we have these differences. It's also important to recognize that there are differences just in our gestures and our facial expressions. So that for the most part, smiling might mean that you're happy, but in some cultures, a smile does not mean that you agree. It just means I'm being polite while you're talking, but I might not actually agree with you. So if you have a patient that is smiling, that doesn't mean that they're happy with the news that they're receiving. It may not even be that they understand, but they're just being respectful and just smiling and perhaps even nodding. But even with that, with nodding, in some cultures, this means no and this means yes. Just that simple thing can be different from culture to culture. How close we are to one another. So for some people, being very close is intimate. So in our culture, meaning America, United States, if I'm standing very close to someone, that suggests that we're in cahoots, we have an intimate relationship, maybe we're involved with one another. But in other cultures, that's just how close you stand when you talk with someone. So someone might be coming up close to you and you're kind of stepping back, but that's just normal speaking distance. Whereas for other people, normal speaking distance is far apart. So even that is something we want to pay attention to. Different ideas about time. Some people, if the meeting starts at 12, that means that you're there at 11:55, and that's just cultural. For others, 12 means 12-ish. You get there when you get there. and you know, the meeting starts when everybody gets there, and that's all. Whether or not physical touching is appropriate. And I'm going kind of quickly through these, but recognize that there are religious differences in who can touch whom. And that for some cultures, it would never be appropriate for a woman of any religion to touch a man. For some cultures, the man can touch a woman of his own religion, but not a woman of another religion. So just again, it's not about, oh my gosh, how am I going to keep all this straight? It's about recognizing that if you go to shake somebody's hand and they don't extend their hand, it's not that they don't like you. It may be a cultural difference. It may be a reason that they can't shake hands with you. And so we don't just jump to those kind of conclusions. And then I'll just mention the eye contact, which is the big one, which is that in some cultures, you show respect by not making eye contact. That is so critical to know, because I think that's one of those things that really gets misinterpreted. It's like, she didn't even look at me in the eye. It's like, yes, because she respected you. And you know, even sometimes we talk about, you know, the exchange of money. Do you put the money down on the counter? Do you put it in the person's hand? Again, putting the money down on the counter is actually a sign of respect in some cultures. So putting it in your hand would be inappropriate. It's not that I don't want to touch your hand, it's that it's inappropriate for me to put the money in your hand. So the point of all this really is just to understand that we want to follow what we call the platinum rule. So rather than the golden rule of treat other people the way that we want to be treated, we want to follow the platinum rule, which is treat other people the way that they would want to be treated, which means we need to understand how they want to be treated and focus on our communication so that we can be culturally sensitive. Thank you.